Back in 2016, the French branded it the deal of the century. So, why is the agreement to sell military-grade submarines to Australia suddenly dead in the water? Canberra ditching the agreement for the chance to buy nuclear-powered subs whose technology is made in the US of A. That's not all. Washington announcing an Indo-Pacific military alliance with Australia and the United Kingdom. That leaves out, well, the only real Western power in Pacific waters outside of the US, France, with more than 8,000 military personnel and a fleet that patrols a vast area stretching across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. France calls the contract poaching a breach of trust, the kind of breach of trust associated more with Donald Trump than Joe Biden, says the foreign minister. What's behind it, what fallout, and what reaction from that other superpower that's critical of the deal, Beijing, which sees plans for a new Indo-Pacific alliance as directly squarely aimed against it and its ambitions in the South China Sea. If tensions were to seriously spike, would France and Europe ultimately be in sync with the US-led alliance? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about what the French are branding a breach of trust among NATO allies. Joining us, Frédéric Grard, Senior Policy Fellow with the Asia Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations think tank. Welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Welcome back as well to David Cameron, Adjunct Professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. How are you?
Fine.
From Stockholm in Sweden, Lucie Béraud-Sudreau, Director of the CIPRI Military Expenditure and Arms Production Program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
You're also the author of French Arms Exports, The Business of Sovereignty. And we're also pleased to welcome Jen Spindell, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of New Hampshire in the United States. Welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. 12 diesel-powered subs from France are now going to become 8 nuclear-powered subs made in Adelaide thanks to U.S. technology. Nicholas Rushworth has more.
The three countries, Australia, the UK and the US, will work together in what's called AUKUS in such areas as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity and underwater defense.
Because we all recognize the imperative of ensuring peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific over the long term. We need to be able to address both the current strategic environment in the region and how it may evolve.
The announcement infuriated the French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian, who said it was a stab in the back.
I'm really angry. What worries me is the behavior of the Americans. This unilateral, brutal, unpredictable decision looks a lot like what Mr. Trump used to do.
For France, it results in the cancellation of a contract with French shipbuilder Naval Group to build a new Australian sub-fleet worth 30 billion euros. Another country angry at the creation of AUKUS, China, which described the new alliance as extremely irresponsible. The Australian Prime Minister invited Beijing for talks.
There is an open invitation for President Xi and I to discuss these and many other matters, and that has always been there. Australia remains open to discuss these and all issues that are important to the Indo-Pacific.
Tokyo, meanwhile, welcomed the creation of AUKUS, saying it was crucial for peace and security in the Indo-Pacific region.
Jen Spindell, we heard the French Foreign Minister again saying in that report, this unilateral, brutal, unpredictable decision looks a lot like what Mr. Trump used to do. Do you agree?
That's a great question. You know, I think that in the coming days, we'll find out a lot more information about what types of consultation, if any, happened. And I know that, it doesn't help for France and the European allies that this is coming on the heels of the Afghan withdrawal, which many in Europe felt they weren't consulted about. I think there were potentially some warning signs in the French and Australian deal dating back to January 2020 when there were reports of delays. But from France's perspective, I can absolutely see how this was unexpected and unpredictable.
And David Cameron, we've already had a bit of a spat today because one White House official telling the French news agency AFP that the French had been consulted. France quick to flatly deny that, saying there was no consultation.
No, and also one can ask about the timing. It's, a day before the European Union launches its policy towards the Indo-Pacific. It's a month before a Quad meeting. One would have thought that this would have been announced on the 24th of September.
Explain what a Quad meeting is for our
A Quad is the four, in inverted commas, great democracies of the Indo-Pacific: India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. But there's something about this which is kind of almost an imperial nostalgia. It's almost recreating the Anglosphere. And one, as a political scientist concerned with domestic politics, I can see the domestic impetus in the United States, Australia, and the UK in pushing for this at this particular time.
It's interesting you say that, Frédéric Grard. For those who follow other parts of the globe, like Africa, we felt what the French call the Fashoda syndrome, this sort of fear or suspicion of the Anglo-Saxons bunched together was something of the past.
Yeah, but I mean, this is not a suspicion of an Anglo-Saxon conspiracy against the French.
It is an Anglo-Saxon conspiracy?
No. This is the reality of a major contract being scrapped all of a sudden. And this is clearly a breach of trust. I mean, this kind of contract is not just coming out of the blue with people buying submarines or whatever system you want to buy out of shelf and so on. This is the outcome of a slowly but steadily built strategic partnership, which was materialized in 2012 by the signing of an enhanced strategic partnership with Australia. I mean, then came the submarine deal, and then came the common vision.
So Frédéric.
The French are being surprised. This is the least they can say.
They're being surprised. However, there were problems with the contract. The subs hadn't yet been built, even though this was signed in 2016. There was criticism in Australia about the cost overruns of this. You didn't see this coming?
No. First of all, there are many things in that kind of contract. I mean, disinformation in arms contract is a rule. Now, there were actual problems in terms of delay and so on, which were being dealt with, to my knowledge at least, between the company and even the French government and the Australian government. Then now the question to be asked is, we are talking of a whole new technology, which is arriving for the first time in history in a country which has no civilian nuclear industry. So in terms of actual capabilities, they can definitely
So what's it about?
built.
What's it about?
No, well, what do you mean, what is it about?
Well, the U.S. has only offered nuclear technology to one foreign power. It was Britain, and it was in 1958.
Yes.
So why would they do it for Australia now?
Well, that's a question to ask the American to start with. There is clearly this question of the Indo-Pacific, but in terms of actual delay, if you want to compare with the French contract, there are many questions to come, and we are only at the beginning of the process. Nothing is fixed in the completely right now, and might take as much time as the French contract, if not more.
Lucie Béraud-Sudreau, you're hearing Frédéric's surprise. Do you share it?
Yes, I agree with what has just been said. I mean, there were indeed some discussions and frictions between the company Naval Group and the Australian Department of Defense with regards to costs overblown and delays. However, it is really a question here that for the Australians, this new contract or this new agreement, will they get a cheaper deal with the US submarines? That's not certain, of course. And as was just said, like what will be the capacity of the Australian side here to maintain nuclear-powered submarines? It's really a whole new capacity that they have to develop here. So I would say that what probably the reason behind this decision is probably not a cost or an industrial rationale, but definitely a more strategic and political decision.
Yeah, because we saw in the past, for instance, when Airbus had a contract to make military transports and it got overruled, that it was definitely about, it was more about industrial interests than military ones. You're saying this is different.
Yes, but I think this is a very big decision in the sense that it's a very significant contract, it's a very high financial stakes, but it's not like unseen in the world of the arms business. You've had in other countries, other contracts, decisions that were made that were then overturned by, let's say, change of government or a new strategic context. So this could have played definitely a role here with the rise of strategic tensions with China in the region over the past few years that might have played a role for Australia's change of heart in this regard.
In any case, France's defense minister is also fuming. You heard the foreign minister earlier. France, which up to now enjoyed deep ties with Australia, no fewer than 6 ports of call on Australian territory.
This is very bad news because it goes back on something that was firmly agreed upon, a contract that was signed 5 years ago. That deal involved the Australian state. It was therefore a bilateral agreement between Australia and France. This is also very bad news for Australia's sovereignty. The goal for them, at the time of this deal, before France had won the bid, had been to boost the country's military capacity in a sensitive region, with the acquisition of military hardware and also technology and expertise. So this news is a huge disappointment.
Well, let's turn to the Australian in the room. David, I feel like asking you what's in Scott Morrison's head, but you heard there the French defense minister saying that this is bad for Australia's sovereignty. You agree?
Yes, I do agree. I mean, what's in Scott Morrison's head is the elections which have to be held next March, and he's very unpopular at the moment. He wants to change the subject about his handling of COVID, like many politicians throughout the world. But this is occurring in a moment where there are 3 intense kind of debates in Australia. The first debate is about relations with China. Should one confront China, or is there another way of dealing with China? And the most vocal critics I've heard so far are from former prime ministers, both the Labour Prime Minister and Malcolm Turnbull, who signed the contract about this decision. The second debate is about the alliance with the United States, the cost and benefits of that alliance. Australia is the only country, as President Biden pointed out, that has fought every war that the Americans have fought since the First World War. What has been the benefits for Australia? They're questionable. And this is occurring, this debate at the moment, where we're celebrating 70 years of the ANZUS Agreement signed in 1951 between Australia, New Zealand and the United States. And thirdly, it's occurring and about this question of climate change, nuclear energy, as some more sort of conspiracy-minded people see this as a backdoor way of bringing nuclear technology, forcing nuclear technology in the civil area on Australia, something that maybe Scott Morrison wants, but something the Green Movement, the Labour Party, is very much opposed to anything nuclear. So it's also very much in the Morrison style of being provocative. There were questions. If it's a question of capability, then the easy way out would have been to have bought the Barracuda nuclear submarines, which already exist. But what Australia wanted 2 things. They wanted their cake and eat it too, so to speak. They wanted to have a submarine which had nuclear-type capacity, and at the same time they wanted to impose 60% local production. Where there wasn't necessarily the skills to be able to do that. And that is one of the reasons for the cost overruns.
All right, let's listen to the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who insists it's nothing personal.
Of course they're disappointed. But I want to be clear, this in no way reflects in any way, shape or form on the attack class submarine, the Naval Group, and the commitment of the French government and indeed President Macron personally to this project. They have been good partners. This is about our strategic interest, our strategic capability requirements and a changed strategic environment, and we've had to take that decision.
David, I mentioned how close the cooperation is between France and Australia already on naval matters. Does this put all of that in doubt?
I don't think it puts it in doubt, but it certainly leaves a bad taste in the mouth, because just a week or 2 ago, Australia was emphasising and saying they were extending this very close cooperation with France. And France and Australia had somewhat similar views of the Indo-Pacific. What is dangerous, from my point of view, in sort of taking on the American view of the Indo-Pacific, which sees it purely in terms of Sino-American rivalry, is to enroll Australia, which is 12 hours flying time away from China, into a rivalry with Australia's foremost trading partner. So what are the advantages of joining this?
Because you had that COVID row between China and Australia. But like you say, more than a third of Australian exports go to China.
Yes, exactly.
Jen Spindell, let me ask you again. I sitting here in Paris, we're a little bit quizzical because of the fact that there's only one other great Western naval power in the Pacific besides the United States, which is number one. And that is France.
I think that looking at the international consequences and Australia's motivations for agreeing to this nuclear submarine deal with the United States, that it starts to make a little bit more sense. As you mentioned earlier, Australia will be only the second country after the United Kingdom to get access to this technology. There's a lot to be worked out. We know in the next 18 months that's going to happen, and also in consultation with the International Atomic Energy Association. But this is a sign really of, I think, growing ties between Australia and the United States, that Australia is more publicly sort of taking a line now against China. And as David said, in some ways, supporting the U.S. approach to the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea. But this doesn't come out of nowhere. This is an agreement, for the U.S. to provide nuclear submarines that many of which will be built in Australia. But Australia is also a partner producer on the F-35 fighter jet. So this is, in my mind, a sort of step towards growing closeness between the United States and Australia.
France has also taken on China. Particularly, there's been run-ins with French ships near Taiwan's waters that have drawn the ire of Beijing. Is France not a reliable partner?
I think that this is less a question of reliability and more a question of meeting the technology and looking towards the future. That, with this submarine deal, Australia has really said that it is sort of hitching itself to the United States, sees the United States as a reliable partner, and is interested in getting the capabilities, as various Australian officials have said, provided by nuclear-powered submarines as opposed to diesel engine submarines. So I think it's the combination of multiple factors there.
And of course, it's a lot about China. We'll talk about that when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at French fury over Australia's decision to torpedo a submarine deal in favor of nuclear-powered technology from the U.S. We're talking about it with Frédéric Grard, Senior Policy Fellow with the Asia Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. David Cameron, Adjunct Professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po from Stockholm. Lucie Béraud-Sudreau, Director at the CIPRI Military Expenditures and Arms Production Program. And from the University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire, we have Jen Spindell, Assistant Professor of Political Science. The word China was never mentioned in Wednesday's announcement of that new military alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US. But that did not fool Beijing.
The relevant countries should abandon their zero-sum thinking from the Cold War and instead narrow geopolitical concepts, respect the wishes of the people in the region, and do more things that can lead to regional peace, stability, and development. Otherwise, they'll shoot themselves in the foot.
Frédéric Grard, we said all along the continuity between Donald Trump and Joe Biden was both promising on the campaign trail to be firm when it comes to China. And we see the reaction there, which sounds a little like a veiled threat when it comes to... does this announcement make the South China Sea a safer or a more volatile place?
I don't think it makes it more volatile because it is already volatile. We have seen the threat growing in every possible way. We have seen the military threat. We have seen the Chinese not respecting their word about non-militarizing the islands in the South China Sea. We have seen the Chinese weaponizing their fishing fleet, for example, in order to back their territorial claim and so on. So this is volatile. There is no question. I mean, the question is really whether something should be done about it and so on. So this is not really increasing the thing. This is something that Beijing itself has provoked and is facing the reaction now. So there is nothing really unusual in what we have heard and seen right now about Beijing. I mean, this is it's supposed to be expected.
So, Lucie Béraud-Sudreau, this brings us back to the point you made in part one of our discussion, saying this is more of a political than an economic decision, if you will. What, are the French less trustworthy than those English-speaking allies of the U.S.?
No. The point I'd like to make here is that despite the reaction in Paris, I would say that this whole decision is not about France. I mean, that's maybe something we should keep in mind, is that the factors behind this decision were probably not really directly related to the relationship with France. And of course, the Australian and French partnership goes way beyond the submarine deal. So hopefully Paris can get over it at some point. As you mentioned, probably the defining factor is the relationship with China and China's growing assertiveness. Having said that, there might be consequences for the European attitude in the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, the US have been asking the Europeans to be more involved through NATO. Also, states in the region have been calling for a more European presence. But this new agreement sends sort of like mixed signals, so to say, for the Europeans, obviously. Mixed signals, and how will the Europeans react then? The European Union just released a new Indo-Pacific strategy, or a new communication with regards to this strategy. So the timing was kind of maybe a bit not very well timed for the EU. I guess we will have to see in the coming days how the European Union assesses this agreement and the consequences for itself. You were going to add, Frédéric Rard, on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that Le Drian, for example, added this morning.
The French foreign minister.
Yes, added in the communiqué last night that this position was inconsistent. And de facto, the US is sending contradictory message. On the one side, it's been asking for a long time now European to be more active in the region. On the other one, it does sabotage the release of the strategy the very day it is released. So somewhere, where is the message for the Europeans? So that's inconsistent with the message of solidarity that the US is asking. This is adding to what we have seen in Afghanistan. Not that it's necessarily decisive on every side, but this is nevertheless not adding to this notion of solidarity with the US. And where do we stand after that?
Jen Spindell, closer to Paris, we can't help but notice that recently the Swiss got cold feet in buying French-made Rafale fighter jets. Do you agree with Frédéric?
Sorry, can you say that again? I think my audio cut out.
Do you agree with Frédéric that the U.S. is sending mixed messages? It wants its NATO allies to step up more, and on the other hand, it shuts out the French.
You know, I really agree with Lucie's point earlier that I think it's important to keep in mind that this isn't about the French. It's Australia's deal with the United States is not about dissing the French or breaking with the French, but it was about sort of a deal that Australia thought that it could make with the United States to better serve its interests. So I think that this is actually consistent, at least with what President Biden has said he wants to do, which is to be able to sort of pull back and focus on what he sees as the core sort of threats and issues, the main one of which is China.
Yeah, speaking of China, this week Vanuatu, which, by the way, used to be a French dependency, announced a deal to promote the Chinese language education in that Pacific Island country. There'll be classes in both primary and secondary school. David Camroux, on Vanuatu establishing warmer ties with China. We're seeing some of the other Pacific islands have been courted as well by Beijing.
Yes, but those kind of challenges cannot be met with military means, and this is in this deal something which is a bit strange, because Australia's immediate area of concern is the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. It's not the South China Sea. The South China Sea is an American obsession.
And we saw it recently with that visit by the Vice President Kamala Harris to Vietnam.
That's right. And so I mean, in this announcement, two countries have been neglected: Indonesia, Australia's largest neighbour, and New Zealand. The Prime Minister already announced that those submarines won't be allowed in New Zealand waters because New Zealand has a policy against anything which is nuclear powered. One actor we've forgotten in all of this is Britain. Because this is a way for Boris Johnson to give flesh to the notion of global Britain in the Indo-Pacific. It's about showing, yes, we are a power in the Indo-Pacific because we're going to be part of this alliance, and it's really in that sense not so much a snub to the European Union, but it's a way of demonstrating that a post-Brexit UK is going to pursue perhaps re-establishing some kind of imperial dream in this part of the world.
All right, snubbing the EU is definitely on the agenda. When you look at the last government reshuffle out of London, which included more hardline Brexiters taking positions of prominence. But the UK also has strong bilateral ties with France. It remains a vitally strategic ally everywhere from Africa to Eastern Europe. Earlier in Parliament, the leader of the opposition asked about it.
Can he guarantee that this arrangement will strengthen rather than weaken the NATO alliance, including our indispensable bilateral relationship with France?
AUKUS is not intended to be adversarial towards any other power, Mr. Speaker, but it merely reflects the close relationship that we have with the United States and with Australia, the shared values that we have, and the sheer level of trust between us that enables us to go to this extraordinary extent of sharing nuclear technology. He rightly raises the question of our relationship with France. Our relationship with France, our military relationship with France, again, Mr. Speaker, is rock solid, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with the French.
So, Frédéric Grard, the sheer level of trust that the UK has with Australia and the US, again, does he have that sheer level of trust when it comes to France?
Probably not, but this is true at the same time that the defense cooperation is intense, is likely to last, but the level of trust, that's something else. Now, you were mentioning before this imperial flavor of the British when it comes to this renewed alliance. Well, one cannot refrain from noticing at the same time that UK is no longer the emperor in that game. So what we see right now is actually a loss of sovereignty on two countries, one of which left the EU precisely to avoid the EU diktat, or even the worst term that Boris Johnson used at the time. So in terms of political logic,
you had the British Prime Minister pledging a stepped-up naval presence in the Pacific.
Well, yes, and we welcomed it, and we'll probably continue to welcome it. But at the same time, one cannot say that this is reinforcing the trust between the two countries.
Do you agree with that, Lucie Béraud-Sudreau?
Maybe we should try to diffuse the drama a little bit here. In a way, this is, again, I think I said this earlier in our debate, but the arms deals and arms contracts can be, overturned. It has happened before. It probably won't be the last time either. So in a way, I think it's more for Paris to digest the blow here. I think it doesn't. It doesn't put into question our alliance with Australia, with the UK, with the US. The military partnerships with those countries will continue. It's more for the French, arms industry to seek for other export contracts elsewhere, and maybe for the French to sort of rethink how they think that arms deals underpin their strategic partnerships in the future.
How much of a blow is it? Because the morning news here in France was of union representatives in Cherbourg off the English Channel complaining it was going to mean a loss of jobs. How big a blow is it to France?
I think the blow here is more specifically for one company, which is Naval Group. Naval Group relies up to 30% of its revenue on international sales. So this can be quite significant for one single company. At the same time, Naval Group is, of course, the main supplier for the French nuclear deterrent, for French Navy. So they will obviously be supported by the French government to overcome this loss of the Australian contract.
Lucie, it's something we've been talking about throughout this conversation. You're somebody who has to juggle the business interests and the security interests of the political interests, if you will. France is one of these countries that is a big arms producer and makes not just small weapons, but sophisticated fighter jets, ships. Is it a winning proposition being that heavily involved in building arms and building military equipment?
Yes, absolutely. France is one of the world's largest arms producers and arms exporters. It's a very significant part of its international commerce, international trade. So it is a really, I think, important also for its diplomacy and its defense diplomacy. And for a very long time, let's say since Jean-Yves Le Drian has been defense minister under François Hollande, defense trade has really underpinned what was called strategic partnerships. So it's been a very important part of the French foreign relations over the past decade. But we can see here that this also has its limits, because obviously those deals can be again overturned. So maybe some thinking should be made also in Paris in that regard.
An over-reliance, Frédéric Grard, on the arms trade, on the arms industry?
I don't think so. Again, I mean, the relationship with Australia did not start with a submarine deal. The strategic partnership was signed in 2012, not in 2016. So this is the outcome of it and not the beginning of it, even if it did actually open a new phase, because there was the prospect of a long-term, solid relationship built on vested interest. But, whatever we might say, it may not be the intention to affect France. That remains to be seen. But the fact it will have consequences on the relationship, and that is being indelible. I don't know if anyone can seriously believe that scrapping that kind of contract after so much investment, not just in the submarine deal, but in political investment, and this goes far beyond the military thing, can be scrapped without any consequences whatsoever in the relationship.
And David Cameron, by the way, this is going to have to go through the Australian Parliament, is it not?
Yes, and the Labour Party, I think at the cabinet meeting, the Labour Party leader was asked to attend exceptionally, but I think it also became a surprise, to the opposition Labour Party. And the
Will
submarine,
it pass?
Quite probably, it's going to put the Labour Party in a difficult situation, because they were behind back in 2009 under Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who proposed the initial idea for the need for these 12 submarines. And it's been something which is supported in a bipartisan way. South Australia, Adelaide, where the submarines are being produced, is an electorally important area that can go either way for both parties. Traditionally votes more for the Labour Party. So there is this dimension to it. There's an element one needs to keep in mind, is that France actually is the largest arms producer in Australia. When the Australian defence industry was nationalised, it was bought by Thales, the French manufacturer. And so these relationships are in other areas, Airbus, helicopters, will continue. But it's true that there's this question of, can that word, keeping your word, so to speak. The cost for France, in the 56 billion euros in the contract, I think France would have received about 8 billion, which is it's not peanuts, but we need to keep this. It's not a 56 billion
It's not 56 billion euro loss for France itself. Jen Spindell, again, your thoughts when you kind of try to follow the money here?
Yeah, I mean, I read earlier today that after penalty clauses are applied with Australia withdrawing from this deal, that France was anticipating a loss of around 10 billion euros, which is still a significant sum of money. But I think, the other panelists do raise important questions about what will arms contracts look like in the future, particularly between Australia and France. Will France try to include clauses to impose stiffer penalties? Or will, as the others pointed out, this close relationship that France and Australia do have in producing arms mean that this eventually is smoothed over and things get back to some sort of standard, regular operational working environment?
Before we go, let's talk about France now. From Mayotte near the African coast to Clipperton Island off South America, the French have nearly 8,000 military personnel deployed to an area that literally spans halfway around the globe. It's home to some 1.5 million French citizens, these parts that we're showing you on this map, with 3 major areas where the French are involved. Sometimes it's French military bases, sometimes it's partnerships. Again, it's the second biggest military presence in the Pacific among Western powers, behind the United States. And for all this talk, and I know, David Cameron, that the French president is a big fan of European strategic autonomy. I believe that's what his phrase is. And we were both talking about this working paper that was put out by the EU foreign policy chief this Thursday. Is France going to remain the only naval power from Europe in the area?
Well, the Germans are sending a frigate, and there's a British aircraft carrier group. So there will be a European military presence. But what the countries of the region want from Europe is not so much a military presence. A survey done in Singapore recently showed that the European Union is the most trusted of partners, not in questions of security, but in questions in terms of investment and development assistance. And so Europe's role in the Indo-Pacific will not go away. It can be strengthened, but it may be in other areas in terms of economic security and questions of climate change, climate security, rather than in token military presence. France is the only resident European military power in the Indo-Pacific, and that will remain. But Europe as a whole has other ways of expressing its significant soft power.
Indeed, I mean, the European strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific was never meant to assert a military presence. This was not the case, and this was not the forte of the European Union in any case. But I mean, if you look at some topics such as connectivity, for example, we started from a strategy in 2018, which led basically to nowhere because there was no funding, it had no priority. Now this is heavily funded, and there are the means that Europe can use in the Indo-Pacific to not just assert itself, but make good for the region itself. So this is the kind of presence which complement the military aspect that the French have been pushing Europe to develop, where we were supposed to be we should be supposed to talk about today if we hadn't had this wonderful deal that we have been discussing for the past half an hour, and which goes totally unnoticed when Europe's role will actually be significant in the region for the first time in a long time.
All right, plenty to talk about still. Unfortunately, we're running short on time. I want to thank you, Frédéric Grard, David Cameron. I want to thank as well Lucie Béraud-Sudreau for joining us from Stockholm, Jen Spindell from Durham, New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.